So have you ever started reading Acts 2 and saw this speaking in tongues and wondered, what does this mean? Is there any extra meaning to this speaking in tongues? Is it simply a form of praise, or is there something else going on here? Well, in this video, I'm going to draw out a few implications to this speaking in tongues in Acts 2. So Acts 2 verse 4 says, "All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them." Now the first thing to note here is that this speaking in tongues is a part of the wider Acts narrative, which is seen as a fulfillment of Jesus' empowerment for the disciples to go out into the world. Remember in Acts 1, Jesus says to the disciples, go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the ends of the earth. Now what's interesting here is that Galilee isn't mentioned. Galilee isn't mentioned in this list. It is Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the ends of the earth. Why isn't Galilee mentioned? Jesus' ministry in Galilee was his most successful. That's where most of his healings occur. That's where he drives out most of the demons. And so it's in Galilee where Jesus is most effective. And so why doesn't Jesus tell the disciples to go to Galilee? Why is it only Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the ends of the earth? Why leave out Galilee here? Well, it's interesting to note two things. The first is that when Jesus ascends to the heavens, the angels come down and address the disciples as men of Galilee. And likewise, in the Acts narrative, we see that the disciples, the 120 that are filled with the Holy Spirit, are likewise identified as Galileans. So what Jesus is saying in Acts 1 is, as Galileans, go to Jerusalem, be my witnesses in Jerusalem. And then as Galileans, go to Judea. And then as Galileans, go to Samaria. And then, as Galileans, you don't need to be called to go to Galilee because that is where you're from. No, the next step is then to the ends of the earth. And so in Jesus' Great Commission in Acts 1, he is telling the disciples as Galileans to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then the ends of the earth. And so we see this speaking in tongues in Acts 2 sort of functioning as a sign, as a symbolic empowerment for cross-cultural ministry, right? Jesus has told the disciples, wait in Jerusalem, for then you will receive my empowerment to go out and fulfill this. And we know that it's going to be cross-cultural. So this speaking in other tongues, this speaking in other dialects that we see in Acts 2 is a symbolic empowerment for cross-cultural ministry. That is, speaking in tongues enables the proclamation of the gospel cross-culturally. Now, the second thing to draw out here is that this speaking in tongues has been called an unnecessary miracle. And the reason why it's been called an unnecessary miracle is because everyone already has a universal dialect that they would have spoken. So when Peter stands up and preaches the Pentecost sermon in Acts 2, he doesn't preach it 15 different times in the 15 different languages. No, he preaches it once because there is a common language. And we think that common language was either Greek or Aramaic. So everyone who's hearing this sermon probably has a common language that they're using to communicate to one another. And so this speaking in other languages is unnecessary because there is a common language. And so why does the Spirit do this? Why does the Spirit enable them to speak in other languages when actually the Spirit doesn't need to do this because there is a universal language, which would either have been Greek or Aramaic? Well, a scholar named Aaron Kuka has argued that this speaking in other languages being an unnecessary miracle is a sign that the Spirit is pushing the disciples towards an identity that is not based on an ethnic-linguistic peculiarity. Now, I know that's a big word, so we're going to unpack it here. The Spirit is pushing the disciples, encouraging the disciples to not base the identity of this new community, this new church that is forming in Acts 2 around their ethnicity. And to give you an example of what we mean by ethnic-linguistic identity, have you ever been in a room where everyone's speaking a different language and you feel so isolated, right? You don't feel like, even though you're in a room full of people, you feel so alone. And then all of a sudden you hear someone speaking English, or you hear someone speaking your mother tongue. You gravitate towards that person because they're speaking a language that you know. And what this indicates is that actually it's one of the easiest ways for humans to divide themselves is through language, is through the language that they speak, right? Intrinsically as humans, we are drawn to people, A, who look like us, and then B, who speak our language. And so when the Spirit enables these early believers to speak in another language, he's saying, I do not want you to base this new church, this new identity around one ethnicity, around one language. No, rather it needs to be based around Jesus. And this is really important because if we are to engage in cross-cultural ministry, one of the tendencies that we can have is that we want to turn people who are different from us into our image. We think if I am engaging cross-culturally, they need to become like me in order to become a Christian. And what this is indicating in Acts 2, this speaking in other languages, is no, actually they don't need to become like you. There isn't one ethnicity that is most like Jesus. Rather, Christianity is adaptive and transcends ethnicity. That the Spirit enables cross-cultural proclamation of the gospel, but also draws us and guides us to affirm different ethnicities and to affirm ethnic diversity. And so why do we have this unnecessary miracle in Acts 2? Why do we have this speaking in other dialects and in other tongues? Well, first it is the Spirit enabling these Galileans to speak to the Jerusalemites and all those to the ends of the earth that have come to Jerusalem at this point. The Spirit is enabling them in this cross-cultural proclamation of the gospel, but it's also directing the disciples and encouraging them not to turn everyone into Galileans, but rather affirming different ethnicities and affirming ethnic diversity. So tell me what you think. Do you think that the Spirit enables us to proclaim the gospel message cross-culturally? Do you see this implication in the speaking in tongues in Acts 2? Or is there a different interpretation that you have? I'd love to hear it in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this unpacking of speaking in tongues in Acts 2, please like and subscribe to this channel. Thanks.